Hi and welcome to today's vlog. Today I am talking about Scaremaze accessibility.
She likes oversharing with outfits and swearing, admiring her tats while she plays with all her cats. Her disability gives her superpower, agility to holiday and live the right way. Estelosaurus.
So it's getting to that time of year. A lot of UK theme parks and amusement parks have opened their annual scare mazes, scare attractions, scare zones, and today I thought I would talk about how accessible some of those scare zones are and how you yourself can judge whether they're going to be accessible for you. So I know there are a lot of different scare events happening. Most UK theme parks or amusement parks have some sort of scare event going on, ranging from ones that are aimed at children to ones that are aimed at full-blown thrill seekers that want to literally wet their pants in fear. I'm going to be talking just about a few of them today, what I consider to sort of be the big ones, the ones that lots of people seem to go to, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about the accessibility. Now, I am flying blind. I've never done any of these scare zones. I've never done scare mazes. They scare me. A lot of them aren't really accessible, so I'm not going to do them. But I have found out a load of information about them, and I'm going to share that information with you today so you can decide if they're accessible or not for you. So first up, I want to talk a little bit about accessibility. The word accessibility is thrown around a lot, and I think generally people don't quite understand what accessibility means. When you say to someone, oh, is this building accessible? What might be accessible to me isn't necessarily accessible to somebody else. So for me, a building needs to be wheelchair accessible. If it has stairs, it needs to have a lift. It needs to have a disabled toilet. Those are things that make it accessible for me. For other people who need different needs met, that building might not be accessible for them. Now, unfortunately, accessibility is a really blanket statement. It covers a huge, broad range of things. So what I am talking about here in terms of accessibility is whether or not wheelchair users or people with mobility issues can use these scare mazes. Unfortunately, accessibility isn't true or false. It's not something that is or isn't. So yeah, what is accessible to someone in a wheelchair might not be accessible to a blind person or someone that's hard of hearing or someone that is neurodivergent. It is really broad, it's really difficult, and it is really hard to cater for and cover for every single person's needs using the term accessibility. So it's tricky, it really is, and I get it, and I get that it's frustrating that actually why isn't it accessible? Accessibility is, unfortunately, for some disabled people, a luxury. It's not a right, and it should absolutely be a right, and that's the frustrating thing. So like I said, today I want to talk about some of the big scare mazes, what you can expect in terms of them from their accessibility, and whether or not it's worth you attending. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Camelot's Scare City. Now, for those of you that are a little bit older, you will remember Camelot for being an epic theme park back in the day. It's now basically abandoned, and in recent years they have set it up each year to be one ginormous scare zone, scare maze type place. I've seen lots of people attend, I've seen lots of videos, it looks terrifying, but is it accessible? Scare City, like I said, is set in what was the Camelot theme park. Now, because it is basically an abandoned waste ground, there are uneven floors, there isn't very much proper flooring, so it's not necessarily wheelchair accessible. It also, according to the Scare City website, has narrow passageways, it has poor topography, which is like the landscape. What the website itself says, it says the Scare City experience is set in an abandoned theme park. Due to the existing topography of the venue, the scare trail consists of undulating surfaces, steps and narrow passageways. Whilst the trail itself is not accessible to wheelchairs or persons with limited mobilities, including frames and crutches, everyone is welcome to join us at the main scare village, which is situated at the entrance, which is free to access and has screens, and the merchandise is there, the toilets are there, the food's there. and there are accessible toilets there as well. So yeah, unfortunately, at this present moment in time, as of 2023, Scarcity is not accessible for wheelchairs or people with frames and crutches, just due to the landscape, the way it's built, narrow passageways, that sort of thing. So I would say, if you have limited mobility, if you require a wheelchair, you're probably not going to be able to go through the scare zones. You're probably not going to be able to do the scare mazes. You can at least go to the scare village, where all of the sort of the music, the entertainment, the food and the accessible toilets are. But no, if you don't live nearby, that's a long way to go to sort of experience nothing really. So it's a bit of a shame, but they have told you beforehand that you're not going to be able to do that kind of thing. It does say that their future events, they are placing accessibility at the forefront of their event planning, especially when they choose an event site. So that's good news for the future, that it might be more accessible. Whilst it is not accessible to me in a wheelchair or someone with reduced mobility, it might be accessible to other people with other disabilities. There are a lot of flashing lights, there is a lot of dark spaces, confined spaces, screaming. So Scarcity might not be suitable for neurodivergence or people who suffer from epilepsy or have specific phobias. So yeah, Scarcity potentially isn't accessible, but you should base your desire to go based on what you know your own needs to be. If you feel that you can manage the scare zones, so if you do have reduced mobility but you feel like you could easily get around these scare zones, then great, it might be worth a look. But generally speaking, Scarcity state on their website that they're not suitable for wheelchairs or those with reduced mobility in the actual scare zones. Like I said earlier, you can visit the sort of scare village at the main entrance. So next up is a similar kind of thing, Tully's Farm. So Tully's have Shocktober. This again is a huge big Halloween event. I've seen lots of videos. There are sort of huge big scare zones, scare mazes. There's all sorts going on. It looks terrifying. This is what Tully's Farm has to say about their event. Tully's Farm intends to make every visit a safe and pleasurable one for all our visitors. However, the attractions during Shocktoberfest may be physically demanding and, due to the nature of the event, unsuitable for visitors with additional needs. For this reason, we reserve the right to refuse admission to any attraction should we feel that there may be a danger to an individual or others during normal operation or in the event of emergency procedures. If you've ever been sort of on rides and you arrive at that, the gate to board the train or the ride vehicle and you're already in a wheelchair, they will often ask you, can you transfer? If there was an emergency, could you walk so many steps? This is a similar kind of thing. Whilst you're participating in a scare zone or a scare maze, if you can't safely evacuate in an emergency, then that is not accessible for you. So even if you say aren't in a wheelchair and everything in it is, fairly flat, but there are stairs out to the fire exit, if you can't manage stairs, that is not accessible for you. You need to be able to exit safely for your safety and for other people's safety. If you can't exit that ride safely, it is not accessible for you, unfortunately. So it says, we hope that visitors accept any decision made with regard to preserving the safety of all our guests. Please note that the provision of any discounts or additional access facilities is provided at the discretion of Tully's Farm. We are unable to fully assess individuals with regards to queuing ability, so provided documentation must include a clear statement of inability to queue and why. That's for fast passes. That's pretty standard procedure. You quite often have to provide proof of a disability in order to get a fast pass of some kind. It's fair enough. It says, in order to access a free carer ticket, proof of disability is required. You can reserve a free carer ticket to your booking. It says you must bring documentation with you on the day to be able to obtain entry. It goes on to give some information about how you can book carer tickets, how you can book disability tickets, and then it says, we recommend all attractions are unsuitable for people with the following conditions: nervous dispositions, heart conditions, pregnancy, claustrophobia, nyctophobia, limited mobility, epilepsy and asthma. And then it also says, the hayride is the only attraction to not include strobes, but it does have flashing lights. The hayride is an open air attraction, but theatre smoke and fires are used around the course. It is possible to accommodate a standard wheelchair as defined by the NHS, that's a standard size, not a bariatric wheelchair, on the hayride. So from all of this information, I would judge that actually it's probably not practical for me to visit there in a wheelchair. I would say if you have limited mobility, you may be able to get around, you're on crutches, then I think it's worth dropping them an email or giving them a ring before you go so that you can check if you're going to be able to be accommodated at their event. There's nothing worse than going somewhere and then being turned away. I would recommend every time that you drop them an email, you give them a ring and you ask them, are you going to be able to do this ride? If I'm in a wheelchair, if I've got this, if I've got that, am I going to be able to go on this attraction? From the videos I've seen, I do not think any of the Tully Shocktober mazes would be practical for a wheelchair, even if you could get a wheelchair through, but it is up to you, it's your discretion. If you speak to Tullys or if you judge that you'd be able to do these things, absolutely go and do them. I would always recommend that you read any information given, you have a look on the website, you give them a ring, you drop them an email. You can often contact them on social media and ask them, are these rides going to be accessible for me? 9 times out of 10 they are more than happy to talk through what the attraction involves and whether or not you're going to be able to do that. So next up, I am going to talk about Alton Towers. So Alton Towers has Scarefest. There are a number of events, mazes, zones and things, entertainment. There's all sorts going on at Alton Towers. This is what Alton Towers has to say about their Scarefest mazes. So it says, due to the nature of our scare mazes, some may not be suitable for guests with disabilities, especially mobility issues. And then it says, please note, Darkest Depths, Trick or Treat Town and The Invitation are the only fully wheelchair accessible mazes. Please be aware that The Invitation is an audio-based experience. So going back to what I was saying earlier about accessibility being a broad up and down spectrum, just because I can go into The Invitation in my wheelchair, making it fully accessible for me, it is an audio-based experience. If you are deaf or you are hard of hearing, that then is not accessible to you. So in blanket terms, The Invitation is not fully accessible, but in terms of just thinking about mobility, it is accessible. So it's really difficult when you ask, is this accessible? And they say yes, they mean in terms of something very different to what you might mean. And you need to be really careful, especially when you're judging it based on these blanket statements. The cat's knocking the camera. So it also says, please note, carers can get 1 free carers ticket per group to assist disabled guests, and you can collect this from the resort box office by providing any of the acceptable carers documentations. And it says, ride access pass will not be valid for our Scarefest mazes, as we operate a time slotted entry to reduce waiting times. For more information based on that, it looks that there are only 3 fully accessible by wheelchair mazes at Alton Towers. Some of the other mazes may be accessible if you have reduced mobility, and it is worth checking before you go. Now, I have spoken to a couple of people, and thanks to those people that helped me find out some more information about this and gave me their own personal experiences. I spoke to someone who told me that Darkest Depths is the most wheelchair accessible. The attic is not, because you have to go upstairs. Altonville, they told me, is too narrow. There's lots of sharp turns and people do tend to push a little bit in there. Now, I do know that outside each maze they do have information on whether it's accessible or not, and there are hosts or staff members situated outside each maze that can tell you whether this ride is going to be accessible. So if you rock up to Alton Towers, because you know that at least 3 of the mazes are wheelchair accessible, it might be that if you go and speak to those staff members, there are other things more accessible to you. Now, I believe that one of the scare zones is in the towers at Alton Towers. Now, I personally wouldn't go expecting that to be wheelchair accessible because the towers are hundreds of years old, and let's face it, disability wasn't really a thing back then because chances are you wouldn't have made it past childhood. So they didn't have to be, castles, you know, hundreds of years ago didn't have to be wheelchair accessible. So I don't expect listed buildings or old buildings that are, you know, basically ruins now, I don't expect those to be wheelchair accessible. And it's kind of silly if you do. It's unfair that they're not accessible, I get it, but they're not going to pop a lift and a ramp in a building that is hundreds of years old and listed. So of course it's not going to be accessible to those in a wheelchair. It might be accessible to everybody else, but if you do suffer from things like neurodivergence, or if you are blind, or if you're deaf or hard of hearing, or epilepsy, if you have epilepsy, anything like that, you need to check before you go that you're going to be able to do that attraction. Please don't just turn up without having done your research. I will say that whilst staff members are told what is and isn't accessible, a lot of people don't understand accessibility. So they might say, yep, it's accessible, come on in, when in reality, it might not be. So please do your research, I would say. Don't go and just end up disappointed. That's my advice. Next up, I'm going to talk about Blackpool Pleasure Beach. That again has lots of zones, mazes. Some of the rides are done over for Halloween. I found it very, very difficult on the Blackpool Pleasure Beach website to find anything out about their accessibility. They also don't answer emails, and they also don't respond on Twitter. Their sort of media team just really needs some work, I would say, because I found it very difficult to find out if any of these events or attractions at Blackpool Pleasure Beach are accessible. There is basically no information on the website at all that I could easily find. I also dropped them an email, more than one email, and I also contacted them on social media, and nobody ever responded to me. So at this moment in time, I do not know what is or isn't accessible at Blackpool Pleasure Beach. Blackpool Pleasure Beach's Halloween event is called Freak Nights. It's been running for a couple of years now, and from what I have heard about it, it does get better every year. Unfortunately, like I said, I can't really find out if it's accessible or not. I've got no idea. Having visited Blackpool Pleasure Beach a few times, I will say that it is a very, in general, wheelchair friendly park. There are lots of ramps to get around. There are accessible toilets. There is a changing places toilet. So in terms of the park itself, it is really accessible. I know that. I know a couple of the rides are accessible via wheelchair, like the Ghost Train, but you have to be able to transfer. And a lot of the other rides are accessible. You can take your wheelchair right down to the ride entrance, but you have to be able to transfer out of your wheelchair. In general, Pleasure Beach is a really accessible park, but like I said, I cannot find out if their scare mazes or scare zones are in any way, shape or form accessible. You might have better luck than me finding this out, but if they can't put somewhere on their website simply to tell me whether this event is accessible or not, then it's probably not accessible. It's not hard to tell me if it is or not. It's not hard to put somewhere easy to find on the website. It's not hard to respond to an email or social media. They employ people to do that. So it's quite frustrating that I wasn't able to find out any information. So if you've been to Freak Nights, or if you're going to Freak Nights and you know if it's accessible or not, for people with limited mobility or people with other disabilities, please let me know. I will say that every scare zone in the history of man seems to feature loud noises and flashing lights and people jumping out at you and screaming. So if it's something that is going to affect you, those events and attractions aren't accessible for you. Next up is Thorpe Park. Now, Thorpe Park is the park I've been able to find out the most information about. Thorpe Park emailed me back straight away to tell me what rides were accessible. They also told me that there would be information placed outside each attraction to tell me what was accessible, and they do have some information on their website. I also spoke to a couple of people specifically about Thorpe Park, and I do have some inside information from someone who actually works at Thorpe Park. So this is what they said. All of the attractions are designed to be wheelchair accessible for guests. Any information regarding this will be on the website. It is not that easy to find though. I did have to email Thorpe Park and ask them where I could find out this information. This person also told me that you can move at your own pace. So if you're in a wheelchair moving, or you've got limited mobility and you're moving through these mazes and scare attractions, you are able to move at your own pace. You don't have to run through them, which when you watch videos back of these events, people do seem to be like running through them really fast, and that was something that concerned me because I can't move fast in a wheelchair, especially if I'm being pushed around. So you can move at your own pace, which is good to know, and it does say that all of the attractions should have ramps and access routes for guests with wheelchairs. So the mazes in general have show captains who are in direct contact at all times with managers and batching crews, so that they know when a guest using a wheelchair or with reduced mobility is entering the attraction. So you can go through at your own pace. There's no pressure to run through, and the actors will respect that once they get information from the show captain. It says guests using a wheelchair or with reduced mobility will be batched at the back of things, so that there's no pushing from other guests. I was also told that all new Merlin mazes that are built specifically for the purpose of being a scare maze are fully wheelchair accessible. They have to comply with certain laws. So if it is built specifically now and it's new, it is going to be wheelchair accessible. Existing structures, existing buildings that are turned into scare attractions may not be as accessible, because probably when they were first built they didn't have to be, and now they just make do with what they've got, which is fair enough. But all new mazes are designed specifically to be wheelchair accessible, which is great news. Well done, Merlin. From all the information I've gathered, I would say, based off of the information I was able to find out and the people I spoke to, I would say that Thorpe Park seems to be your best bet for accessible mazes. It seems like it has a lot of really great options. It sounds like staff really know what they're talking about, and Thorpe Park was the only theme park that actually got back to me, that actually emailed me back about the event to give me more information, which I was really grateful for. I had nothing at all from Pleasure Beach. Alton Towers directed me to their website where the information was. Because I've never done scare mazes, I asked some people that have done them, you know, what it was like. Do you have to run through them? Are you being pushed? You know, can you maneuver a wheelchair around? Is it going to be easy? And a lot of people told me that they do have small spaces. It is dark. They do have sharp turns. It's not easy to navigate a wheelchair in the dark when there's likely to be obstacles. I also spoke to people that have said that they attended some mazes where there were bits you had to crawl through, bits you had to duck under or climb over. There were things hanging from the ceiling which you had to, if you're in a wheelchair, you have to maybe try and get through those things. That might not be that easy. So yeah, people did tell me that whilst they felt in general mazes were accessible, there were maybe some obstacles or some things within those mazes that might make them less accessible to those with reduced mobility or those in a wheelchair. I would say certainly based on the theming, the fact that it's in the dark, the fact that there's often strobe lights, people jumping out on you, people screaming at you, mazes and attractions may not be accessible for guests with neurodivergences. My advice when attending scare events would be to check before you go. If you're able to, just get in touch with the parks, get in touch with maybe people that you know that have already done the mazes, done the attractions, and ask them if they think they're going to be accessible for you. At the end of the day, you know your own limitations the best. So if you do your research, you're probably going to be able to have a really enjoyable scare season. You could probably attend a huge amount of these scare zones, a huge amount of these scare attractions, and have a really whomping Halloween. I would say do your research first. Don't turn up and then be disappointed or be turned away, because that's no fun. Nobody wants that. Like I said earlier, some of these scare events just right off the bat aren't going to be accessible for those with reduced mobility or those in a wheelchair, like Tully's, like Scare City. And they are at the very least upfront about it. They have told you before you go that they're not really going to be ideal for you, and that's fair enough. I think it's a real shame that in general the websites for these major theme parks don't make it easy to find accessibility information. They really don't. You have to really dig around. It's not obvious where it is. You have to dig through the website, you have to click through links, you have to go back and forth. Sometimes you have to email the park to ask them where to find the information, because it's not always that clear. So I do know that once you arrive at an event, each attraction will have an information board outside, a restrictions board, and it will tell you on that board a little bit of what you can expect, and it should tell you if it's suitable. It should tell you what conditions that the ride is not recommended for example, if you're pregnant, or if you suffer from backache, or if you're scared of the dark, or if you suffer from epilepsy. It should tell you on those restriction boards outside each attraction whether it's going to be suitable for you. I will say that you should bear in mind that all of these scare zones, all of these scare attractions, all of these scare events have live actors in them whose job it is to scare the crap out of you. It is their job to get in your face, it is their job to shout at you, it's their job to scream and scare you. So if you're not into that, if that's something that is going to affect you or affect a disability or something that you have, just bear it in mind, you know, that's their job. They're there to sort of scare the pants off you. So if that is something that for whatever reason you're not going to be able to handle, then probably scare events aren't ideal for you. So that's it really. I know this is sort of quite limited information. I just wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of what you may and may not be able to do, and a little bit of an idea of what accessibility means in terms of these scare events. And saying something is or isn't accessible isn't helpful, because accessibility is such a blanket statement. It covers so much, and what is accessible for one isn't accessible for another. What's accessible for me isn't accessible for you. It's really hard for, I guess, any business to state whether something is accessible for everybody or not. It's really hard. You can't just say this isn't accessible, this is accessible. That's unfortunately not how it works. So hopefully this has given you a little bit of an idea of what may or may not work for you, and hopefully it's given you a little bit of an idea of how you can judge whether something's going to be accessible for you. Like I said, I haven't done any of these events and scare mazes myself. For me personally, some of them aren't accessible in a wheelchair anyway, and also so many of these events contain strobes and flash and light effects. This is something that would really affect part of my disability, so unfortunately scare mazes and scare events aren't for me. It's not accessible, so whilst it's wheelchair accessible, it's not accessible in another way, so I still can't attend. And again, my top tip is please try and get in touch with these venues, ring them, email them, see if you can get hold of them before you go. Do your research and make sure that these attractions, these events, these mazes, make sure they are something you are going to be able to do. Don't turn up and get turned away. That's my advice. If you've already attended some of these events, drop your links below so that people can check out the mazes, check out what the events are like, and judge for themselves whether it's going to be accessible or not. That would be really helpful. If you've got any questions, please drop them below. I'll try my best to find out an answer or answer them myself. A very happy Halloween. If you attend a scare event, I hope you have the best time, and I hope if that is what you want, that it is pants wettingly scary for you. Thank you to everyone that helped me find out information about these events. Thank you to everyone that answered my weird questions about accessibility. It was much appreciated. Thank you as always for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll be back soon with another video.